my name is Matthew, and I'd like to tell you a story about changes. Every here and there you hear a story about immutable infrastructure, infrastructure as a code, treat servers like cattle, not pets, your devs spin up environment and tear them down with joy. But not every environment can be treated like that. You cannot create and destroy your production Active Directory now and then. You cannot do the same with the Exchange. You cannot do that to a monster legacy server app that's running a legacy app for 10 years. Because rebuilding that every week would be troublesome, at least. It would be good to have a documentation of the environment. Przemek did a great stuff about documenting Active Directory before. This morning, I'd like to show you a little bit different approach, how to baseline your Active Directory and store that as a code, so you can compare that automatically in time, how using Pester test your Active Directory, whether it's in optimal shape and the configuration didn't change, and how to use Azure Log Analytics to store the data through the time and analyze the results in Power BI. All of this with a bit of PowerShell, Azure, Git, and new old module of mine. So let me know you first. Who doesn't know what Pester is? One person. Okay, that's good, because I won't be using Pester in a standard way. Who does test Active Directory regularly? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4 questions off. I'm not your manager, so instead of nagging you, let's have some fun with PowerShell. So what's on the menu today? Pester, pchecks AD, and Azure. If we mix that together, we get a good recipe for dual maintenance daily tasks. I'm going to tell you why I'm using Pester and what differs this solution from others. You probably could have seen this year, previous year on the internet. What pchecks AD is and why it sounds familiar to DBHX. That's right, so. And also about a few words about log analytics, Kusto query language, and Power BI. So, Pester is here, is going to stay, it's going nowhere away. So there are a number of community projects written around it. Last year I released OVF module and OVF diagnostic for testing Active Directory, DHCP, S2D nodes. Ravi showed his approach to testing Dell deployment servers from bare metal. SQL community released DBHX. This was a big bang last year. They were writing that in secret for a few months in a great team. While they were doing that, I, not knowing, was working on my project called PPOSH OVF and PPOSH OVF Diagnostics. PPOSH stands for Polish PowerShell User Group, if you're wondering. We were able to test Active Directory, DHCP, VNS, Hyper-V servers, and S2D clusters with that. It is running in production for nearly 2 years right now. There were some enhancements to the module, some additions, so instead of... And also there's the community effort to release S2D checks, which will be more far advanced than my module was. So I decided to split my functions and create pchecks AD, which I intend to rewrite again with the Pest framework and release as AD checks. So why OVF? Why not use something like DSC, Chef, or Puppet? For ops, for us, for most of you, how many of you are ops? So for most of us, change is something constant. We change our environments all the time. By change, I mean a reboot, an upgrade, a patch release, just even RDEPing to a server can change stuff. Upgrading firmware or drivers can change a lot of stuff on your server. So our service can also be dependent on other modules, other components of our environment, like network, like storage. DSC will configure your server, your Active Directory, or your SQL server, but it won't configure your switches, firewalls that the network team is doing. And OVF will be for your environment, for your service as integration tests for the code. It does not only test whether this specific feature works, but it will also work how does the user sees the service and the feature from outside. Not everything can be managed through DSC. Imagine restarting a server after patching and waiting for Chef or Puppet to kick in and test whether the server still is compliant can sometimes be crucial. It can be moments, it can be minutes. Also during troubleshooting, running DSC is not always welcomed, so it's good to have some automatic tests to do that for us. Why I'm not using Microsoft PowerShell operation validation then? That was released some time ago. At first, when I started building the modules, the OVF released was behind Pester, so it was lacking the features I needed, and it was lacking the output I needed, and all the additional features that are in the OVF diagnostics and right now in PCX-AD, like writing to event log, writing to Azure log, would have to be added anyway. So I decided to take a little bit different approach and rewrite it by myself. So PCX-AD is way more simply in terms of configuration comparing to the BHX, but right now, what can it do? It runs from a single server and tests everything using invoke command to your DCs. So no need to install anything on your DCs. And that also helps if your DCs are in different versions, like 2008, 2012, and 2016. There's no module dependencies on your workstation because you're using native commands from the server itself. It can automatically create the baseline of your AD realm into a JSON file, which is a human-readable form that you can use as a documentation, or store it in Git and later on recreate your AD if needed. It has following details like forest configuration info, domains included, global catalogs, details, sites, trusts, last backup status, and per node basic information, time service configuration. Once it gets the data, it can validate and compare. By validate, I mean it checks if all necessary services are in fine shape. And by compare, I mean getting previous configuration and testing whether all settings should or are the same. Everything can be narrowed to test only against a specific tag or a specific node. So if you are restarting one AD server, maybe there's no need to test all the servers, just that one. Or did you upgrade the drivers on one AD server? Just test that with that configuration and tag a node. The results can be either written into event log, XML file, and then reused by report unit to create HTML reports, or it can be written right now into Azure Log Analytics, where more fun stuff happens. So the concept is quite simple. We use a single management station server that, with scheduled tasks or jobs, query our service, our Active Directory, using invoke command for current status of host configuration. From the data retrieved, we can create baseline and, if needed, if required, store it in a file. Use Pester locally on our machine to test whether the configuration and the operation is okay. That means we can have the newest Pester version on our station and don't fiddle on DCs. And then store the results in XML file, event log, or Azure. What's happening there? We can either monitor event logs using your current solution, be it SCOM, Zabbix, Nagios, whatever you're using. We can forward all the logs through WEF to a central server. We can create HTML reports from the XML in automated fashion. And we can also use Azure dashboards and Power BI to visualize the data. Or use Azure Monitor to alert on specific events. If anything happens, like there's no connectivity between DCs, we can set up a monitoring alert that will trigger and notify us on Teams, email, phone, whatever. So that's enough for the slides. Let's have some fun with PowerShell. Everything we'll be doing today is already on GitHub. It's in my PCX-AD module, with all the documentation and all the information, what has to be done to set it for yourself, to set up the OVF server in your environment. It requires one module, PCX-AD, and it requires a SAT on the station for some basic stuff. Then we need how to create a baseline, which is quite simple. If you provide computer name, it will get the baseline only on that node. If you don't provide computer name, for example, only credentials or nothing at all, and you run that on your domain credentials, which is not good. Then it will create the baseline of your whole AD. It will query for all DCs, how many you have them, and test that and put into baseline. Then we can, once we have that, we can export the baseline into file. The output should look like this. So there will be a folder with nodes, with configuration specific to each node, and there will be one file for all Active Directory containing the forest details, DC details, etc. So to create your baseline, there are 5 lines of code, effectively. And you have your AD baselined. It takes 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, and you have something to work on and chew on later on. What then? We can create an Azure Log Analytics workspace that will configure, all the code is here. So with this, you can configure the workspace. You can create it on your private account or on your company account. Azure Log gets like 5 gigs of data monthly for free, so we don't pay for that, and that's a huge amount for logs, text logs. The only thing you will pay is ingestion of the data, which is also quite small, as you will see later on. It costs nearly nothing. If you have the 5 gig limit, it's good to set a daily cap, so your tests won't get more data a day, so that your tests will run every day, not like for 2 weeks and then you're off with the storage. And finally, we will get the ID for the workspace and the key to export the data. Here are some examples what should be run, how to run the code. So this will be, as previous showed, to create the baseline, to run checks. For example, to run all the operational checks, we need to prepare the folders where the checks will be stored, the reports will be stored. And invoking operational check requires just this. You tag operational, put in your credentials if required, and that's it. Invoke pchecks ID. We are done. You can also add more stuff like, I want to test only a specific node. I want to target only tests for nodes. I want to test only specific subset of nodes. I want the file generated to be of specific format with the current date, with the current file name. I want to write to event log, so every action can be written to event log with success information and failure. What you do with your logs is up to you. We can also run only configuration tests. Then we need to add where the current configuration is, because it will complain and won't run if we put the hash table as empty. Here's an example of running these checks with customer ID and shared key to put into your Azure Log Analytics, and full options included as well if one requires. And also how to generate the HTML reports. So I will show you the lab we will be working on. Just let me log in. I pre-created a lab that consists of a router that will be acting as router, effectively, sorry. There are 3 sites, site 1, site 2, site 3. In first site, I have 2 DCs, DHCP server, file server. Then the second site with DC and DHCP, third site the same. I also have 2 management servers, so management from where I run all the commands if needed. OVF, this is the server we'll be using right now, and VETS, which gathers all the logs. That's for a different demo. So let's hop in and see how that works. Sorry, one more thing. How does the guts look underneath before we dive in and start running? So this is a sample index file. Index for this module is like an index in a book. Because Pester right now does not allow to run only specific file with specific tag, it has to look into each file and then decide whether the tag exists. So I created an index file where you specify where are the tests, what kind of tests are those, what tags it runs on, target, and parameters. So when you enter the invoke pchecks ID with specific set of commands, based on the index file, it will know which tests to run, then load those files and run only those tests. This is a workaround. As Jacob said, in Pester v5, it will be possible to have to run only tests, only those files that have the specific tag, and this workaround can be omitted. As you can see, I have a few additional tests with specific tags. If I will run a tag configuration, it will run every configuration tag, but I can specify my own. I mean, only one. So this is the index file. Invoke pcheck has a few regions. First, it gets the index file. What it means is you can modify the index file for yourself. You can have your own index based on my index, add tests, remove tests, and not fiddle with the module. So it will accept your path when the index is. It will filter the index based on the parameters we provided. So it will prepare the basic filtering first. Then it will get all the actual checks from the folder. Again, you can provide your own folder with your own checks, providing that they will have the same structure as the index file requires. You can add as many tests as you wish. It would be best to provide them in the repository, but if your environment is so strict that you don't want to share the test you're running, you can just specify your own folder, copy mine tests and add yours test. Then it will filter those tests it loaded based on the checks on the tags it had before. And finally, it will apply all the filter checks to each of the file. Each of the file will be processed, then decided whether it should write the tests to, for node test, for example. If we didn't provide Active Directory nodes, it will query first for Active Directory. Then it will, this command does not require Active Directory, credentials. It's available for any user. That is why we need RSAT on our local station to get the basic information anyway. And then it will write, depending on the parameters, events to it will perform. This is, any of you worked with Azure Log Analytics before? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. The thing is that Azure Log Analytics is not a database like a relational database. We have to create our relations ourselves. It's a flat storage, and it requires additional parameters like invocation, end time, start time, a specific batch GUI, things like that. This is what this function does. Effectively, it takes any PS object, JSONify it, so flattens into JSON, adds those parameters, and using REST API sends to Azure. So I need those two parameters in here. They take a time mark, start the test, take the time mark to have a comparison later on, and then depending on the parameters, I store in the event logs and log analytics. What does, how does it work underneath for the baseline? So it has some public and private functions, some helpers written around basic commandlets that will get all the forest details, parse it. It won't be all the details. It won't be like you run get AD forest and you have like 30, 50, 60 properties. I will filter only those that I need right now for the tests, and only those I think are required to get into configuration. It's also not a problem to add more. A sample configuration for my domain. We've got the name. This is a hash table which is not ordered, so depending how you run and on your environment, the keys can be in different places, but they will all be the same. So we've got the name, we've got the forest mode, root domain, who holds the FSME roles, what domains do we have. So it can run on a single DC, it can run in multiple environment, it can run in multi-trusted environment. It will, depending on the environment, create a specific JSON file. Also, the password policy, maybe not good name enough. High groups means you can specify, it defaults to these two groups, but you can specify your own high groups. What does it mean for you? You want to check whether these specific groups did change. So it will query all members of those groups. It can be your my super secret admin group, and it will use that as well. Then all the sites, whether it has subnets, whether it has location added, everything's written into general configuration. And then we have a specific node information, like network address, MAC address, what's the IP address, whether it's DHCP or static, what's the DNS address, things like that. This is required in cases you want to rebuild your server or you're looking for information on the network and, for example, your DC is down. So how to check what was the MAC address of the DCs when it's down, and you want to chase on the switches. Where was the MAC address last seen? This can help. So we've got some information. What roles uninstall on the server? What's the network configuration for jumbo packets for registry? This is based on S2D checks for the Hyper-V, so this is the legacy. Then we have the code to deploy the checks. When you look into the code, it has a specific meaning. All the remote code will be run on a specific server. Everything that's local will run on your machine, meaning that the whole code in here will install all the features required on the OVF machine, configure the TLS for the server to seamlessly write details into Azure, create necessary folders for reports, create a task. Right now I'm a little bit cheating. I'm still working on creating in-memory only task from the code from a remote machine. Right now I'm getting all the details, all the workspace details, putting into file and creating a scheduled task pointing to a file, which works. So not a problem. And then this is what creating the task schedule is. I have already deployed the environment. The thing is that once you configure Azure Log Analytics Workspace, it takes up to 30 minutes for the first log to appear in the log, so it would be pointless to create it right now. Also, the environment had to be fed with all the details, so it was running before. But trust me, the code works. This will allow us to create workspace for our logs. Here it is. And two-factor out, because why not? We want to stay secure. So what it does, it connects to my subscription. This is, for now, the only way to create subscription is through the GUI. There's no automatic way to create it, either through Graph, Azure template, whatever, you have to go to the GUI. Then it will get all my subscriptions, push them to out-grid view, which I can select where I want to do that. Selects it, creates a workspace. Let's call it test. Create a new resource group. Create a new insight workspace. And because we will need those details in our code, we're going to display that. It's also possible to write those export CLL XML file on your OVF server and during the task run import the details instead of providing manually by hand. Any of you don't know how export CLI XML works for credentials? Thought so, okay. So right now we're waiting for the ID. And it's running. VS Code. Okay, so we've got the key, so this is the password, and this is the username. Basically, the workspace ID and the workspace key are username and password. This subscription will be deleted anyway after the conference, so not an issue. Then we have the query, so possible queries for our log analytics. You can build simple ones. You can build advanced ones. I will show you how to omit and forget about Azure Log Analytics for basic stuff. Let's get back to the lab. So let's run with only credentials stored on disk under this user context. Let's check whether we have the folders and create the baseline. Right now, as you can see, it queries my AD, gets all the information and stores in file. It can take up, this is a lab on single server, so the virtual machines are not top-notch, but in my production environment, getting all the information from ID takes about a minute and a half, even through VPN. Then we will run some operational tests. They still have hard-coded information, what I consider operational, meaning password length and things like that. It can be adjusted. It should be adjusted in parameters section. For now, they are hard-coded, but it checks services like every DC should have running, whether they have automatic setup, is everything running with the time. What additional checks are, for example, for time. If you have DCs that are virtualized, they require a specific setting. Who does disable time service synchronization on your Hyper-V host to your DC? Good, because no one should. The DCs should synchronize the time during the startup and only during the startup. And to make that happen, we have to provide additional registry entry that will tell DCs, okay, once you start up, use NTP server instead of Hyper-V because it can cause havoc. For example, Hyper-V under heavy load can cause VMs to slow down, which will cause the time to drift. If the DCs checks NTP servers not very often, it will change its time. So that is why we need that during startup. And it checks for that. Okay, we've got the basic configuration. Right now, it gets only operational checks, tells me where the folder, in which folder it will look for operational tests, runs after every test it has, after every DC. Those warnings were about backup, because this is a test environment, so I didn't back up, and it complains for each DC that it was not backed up for the past 7 days, which is not good for a DC. Then we can run the same checks, but write the information to file. There's the event ID base. So within the module, there is the logic that every information has the base plus 1. So the ID will be 1001, and warning will be 1002 with errors, so you can filter event log later on based on what you need, and the source will be pchecks AD. The first run has to be done as administrator on your local machine to create the source. After that, you can run as a regular user because you are providing credentials anyway for Active Directory, so no need to run the scheduled task as admin. Then we can run the configuration checks. It loads the JSON file because I didn't provide the nodes, so it assumes I want to test every Active Directory DC, loads the configuration from JSON file, then loads the configuration from the node and compares each value, whether they're the same and where's the drift. This is good if you have clicky admins in your domain or someone that does not provide documentation after the change. Running this every day quickly gets you who did change something and where, and you can easily go back or ask them to provide a proper documentation for that. Then we can send the logs to Azure. As you can see, I have the key and the ID in here. Let's make it run till the end. How does it look like in the event log? So I already filtered that. We see what I'm building in a message in the event log is the full context describe context it message. So anything you put in a test as a describe context it will be passed into event message. So when it fails, you know why. When it fails when your test has a because clause in your tests, it will also be added in here. So that's helpful in case something's broken. If everything's okay, it just stays with the information log. Okay. Let's assume it's done. How does the HTML look like? It runs an external binary called report unit that understands XML files created by Pester. Underneath, it creates the file. It gets into each XML file and then creates HTML files and index file. It will take him a while, so let's stop it and run the current index file. Yes. So this is how looks the basic report. You can get all the failed tests, all the success tests. You can, because the files are marked with date, you can easily spot the date that something went wrong. And the file also contains the test name, so you will know whether the configuration test failed, whether the operation test failed. If we dig into this, it will unravel, and we will see that, for example, backup status did fail on us with the message. Well, for 7 days, we don't have DC backup. Let's take a look at that. Also, it will tell you about the default policies. Well, I expected the password policy to have 7, but because it's not good to have short password, but I had 7. I expected more than 7, and I had 7. That's an error. By adding those parameters into your tests, you can easily, for example, prepare for a change. If you have a cab in your company and want to provide a change that will increase the password to 12 characters, you can create a baseline, just editing a JSON file, saying, I want 12 characters, run it before the change. You will have an error, change it, run it after change. You have the whole documentation required for the cab. Yes, the change did succeed, everything's okay. But that's not beautiful, and that's not helpful if you want to dig through what's going on and what happened where. So right now we're going to move to Azure Log and see how the information look like in Azure. So because I called it PHXID and the identifier in the script calls that PHXID, Azure creates for me a custom log, PHXID custom log, with all the data. If I'll narrow to last 30 minutes, I probably see tests from 6 p.m. The whole time is in UTC, so let's fix that. Right now we see it's from 16 from today. And I see all the information that were in the tests. How does that look like if we dive in? We see that the management server that ran that was called rcallvf. Time taken was 13 seconds. It did verify Active Directory services for connectivity issues. There were none to S1, DC1. The controller is online. Still, this is good if you want to dig through the data, if you want to narrow your searches, if you have other logs in Azure that will allow you to correlate data. For example, something crashed, you had a Windows update running, and you want to verify whether after the Windows update, the servers brought up correctly. So there are already prepared queries for you. Like, for example, compare results in time. This will check what tests were okay and right now are not okay, or in a different way, what test failed and right now passed. When did it happen? How long did it happen in hours and days? What did change? What was the previous value? What's the current value? So we can have a comparison for that. We can also check only failed tests in time. So with which tests fail on us in our environment all the time without the green, because if something's green, we usually don't want to see that. We only want to see what's bad, especially when we have less time. This query will get us all the checks in numbers. What did fail? Sorry, it's the same. To stats. This will summarize in each describe block how many tests we have succeeded and how many tests we have failed across the 7 days or across 1 day. As you can see, getting all the data is quite fast. For 30 days, I have 9 records in here. Okay, so that's clear. How many records do I have? For last 7 days, I have more than 10,000 records. As you can see, it results only in 10,000. This is the UI restriction of Azure, so don't be surprised. It will show you only 10,000 records. If you use Power BI, which we're going to use in a second, you can get 500,000 records. If you narrow the search, it will show you. Anyway, 10,000 records under 1 second. So this is what I call fast, if you want to search through the logs. And it's free. What we can do after we run a rule, we can set up a monitoring rule. So for example, if any DC fails, I want to see that in my Teams, in my Slack channel. Because sending events from Azure to Teams is currently a little bit broken. I mean, they require specific JSON, which not always works. The best way to notify Teams is just to grab the email from the channel and use that to notify Teams. For the PCX ID, as you can see, I have all the alerts and details. You can use Slack, you can use whatever you need. How much does it cost? Well, I've set up the lab on 21st. At this date, I set up monitoring, and it still assumes, because it monitors both my previous demo for web forwarding event logs and for PCX, it tells me it will cost me in a month €2. If I have only PCX, it will be under €1 for a month. So that's not a lot to have. Imagine how much you have to pay for the SQL server to store the data, or how much time do you spend maintaining the SQL server to store the data. Is it worth €1 of your time? So we also have Azure dashboards. Based on the custom query language, we can create dashboards for PChecks, for example. Tell me only what checks failed. Tell me all checks that passed with a date time selector. What was the tests? If we click on any of those, we will be transferred back to Azure Log, which we can dig further in. That's the one thing. But something I'm most happy about is that we can provide a Power BI for our support team, and that requires no knowledge from them about custom query language, where are the logs, how to dig through them. It's even easier for us to, in a daily driver, to get that. We just need to wait till it loads. It requires my credentials to connect to Azure Log Analytics. As you can see, it's not up to date. Last refresh was on the 2nd. Because the Power BI delivered with the module has my credentials cleared, so you'll have to provide your own. But it will try to hit my Log Analytics to fix that. Yeah, I know credentials. To fix that, the tutorial is also on GitHub. We go to Edit Queries, and then in here you replace this string with the ID you have for your logs workspace, and that's it. Then you hit refresh, close and apply, then you hit refresh. It asks you for your credentials. I'm using my company credentials, my own company. Then it logs me in. Will also require two-factor authentication. And because I set to only, for example, this workspace, so a different workspace may require different credentials, it's not a problem. I connect only to this one. It takes them a while. And it automatically refreshes. It should load more data with the time in here. So we've got over 2,000 to 20,000 tests. It took them nearly 6 hours to run all the tests. It's scheduled to run every hour and get only operational checks. So this is this data. I have all the tests in here and all the failed message. If I'll slice only for failed and only, for example, for one DC, it will automatically narrow this. And if I click on that, it will give me the error message in here. For example, necessary services are running. I have only... So for example, for connectivity, it expected no errors on the connectivity, on the ping. It had some errors. It displays that. We see that this test took 20 seconds. 1 second. 1 second to run. So we can also narrow down the time we want to query. This helps in basic troubleshooting. This helps when you want to answer your manager, what's my ID status? Does it work? Did it work yesterday? Did it work when you were with friends at beer? We had some problems. People were complaining they could not log in. You just launch this and say, well, these tests show that from the OVF management server, he could get to the Active Directory, so should get people. If there were some issues, look in the network, look in the storage, look somewhere else. Maybe there was a problem between the key and the keyboard and the chair. Okay, so let's back to the presentation somewhere here. Okay, so wrapping it up, this module, PCXID, will allow you to create the baseline, test the baseline in time, create configuration changes, write the event logs, write to event logs all the information it can get from the validate or compare, or use Azure Log Analytics for that. All the slides and code are already in GitHub in my repo. I will link them in the psconf.eu repo, so if you'd like to download or use the code, it will be there. If you have any questions, any questions? Yep.
Can we add our own tests to the solution?
Yes, you can. If your tests will have the same structure, so if you require credentials, if you require computer name, and put that into the parent block, and then add into index.json file saying I have a test that's called like this, and it is in here, sure, you can provide your own path for index, you can provide your own path for tests, so you can totally get my module and say, I'm not happy with your 7 days backup, 2 days is too much for me, just replace that. If you require less or more password complexity, you can update that. This is a JSON, very readable form, and running the tests point, this is the index file and the test you should look instead of the default ones. So it will respect that. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
You talked about credentials, which group memberships does the credentials have to have domain administrators? Or?
Well, basically, if you get into DC, you need to have domain credentials. So it uses invoke command to get into the DC, to use commandlets natively on the node. So yes, it requires domain credentials to get to the node and get all the information.
Domain credentials or domain?
Domain admin credentials. If you create a GI endpoint and you use that only for subset, it will use as well. But right now, it requires domain credentials to run. If you omit all the node tests, and test only the Active Directory, which does not require Active Directory permissions, credentials, domain admin credentials, it can use your regular account to test the domain. Any other questions? Yep.
You remarked that you not a problem that you could not create an Azure subscription to REST API.
Well, you have to create the workspace beforehand. So if this scripts will fail, you can try manually, but it requires subscription, it requires ID and key. So before you send any logs there, you have to create it manually or with a script, but by yourself. It does not, by running, it does not create the workspace. It requires it beforehand.
Yes, Maar die vraag was, als je op eind wil,
Mhm.
er is een REST API in preview, through which you can create
A new subscription.
a subscription automatically.
Finally, gladly. Good to hear that.
So it's coming soon. It's not now in preview.
Good to hear that. It was missing. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me. Have a good day.